Greetings and welcome to the Black Flame Podcast, where history and legends collide, where cryptids, the supernatural, and the paranormal run free.
We are your hosts, Dan and John Leonard, and we are here to bring you stories of haunted places, creepy cryptids, and harrowing legends. So sit back and let us guide you through the world of the unexplained.
Tonight we'll be covering Romanian vampires and the New England vampire panic.
So stick around to learn more about these two eerie legends. Everyone is familiar with Bram Stoker's famous 1897 book Dracula. This book would pave the path for what we know as vampires today. Bloodthirsty, undead monsters that would sleep in coffins only to rise at night to feed on the blood of the innocent. Nowadays, it's fun to fantasize about these creatures. We make movies about them, they're in books we read, we even wear costumes to look like them. But in Romania, vampires are something all too real. The legend of vampires in Romania dates back centuries. But what if I told you that the fear of vampires still haunts the Romanian people to this day? The original people of what is now Romania were called Dacians. In the years between 105 and 106 AD, the Roman Empire went to war against the Dacians, but the strong Roman Empire would crush them and would take over their land. Roman settlers would start moving into their new land and would Romanize the local Dacian people and have them start to speak Latin. But by the year 271, the Roman emperor had to pull the Romans out of Romania due to the giant cost of always having to defend their land from the local Dacians. The Dacians were a hard and rugged people, but they lived and were afraid of evil spirits that they called strigoi. The strigoi were said to be evil spirits that would possess animals like bats or wolves, but the strigoi would later become known as vampires, or evil spirits that would kill people under the cover of darkness. In Romanian mythology, there are two kinds of strigoi that are either dead or alive. Some accounts say that the living strigoi are ghosts, that are poltergeists, they throw things, make noises, things along those lines. But other stories tell living strigoi as being witches or sorcerers, casting spells on the townsfolk. But dead strigoi are something totally different. They are said to be much more dangerous. They are known to come back from the dead and return to their family. While they're there, they act like nothing has happened. But then they slowly start to kill their remaining family. The dead strigoi are said to have no souls, unlike the strigoi that are alive. They are said to have powers that include shape-shifting, they can turn invisible, and in some stories, they could even fly. And of course, they are known to suck the blood from people and animals. So you may be asking, how does one turn into a strigoi? Well, based on Roman folklore, there are a number of ways one turns into a strigoi. Some include being the seventh child of the same sex in a family, leading a sinful life, dying without getting married, die from suicide, execution for perjury, or you were cursed by a witch. But there are also ways to prevent one from becoming a strigoi in the first place. One way is if a child is born and the newborn bites the umbilical cord, those present must remove the cord, burn it, mix some of its ashes in water, and be served to the baby to drink. Another way to prevent strigoi from appearing is to ensure a proper burial of the dead. This means tears must not fall on the deceased. The name of the deceased must not be called out loud. The burial hole must be dug on the day of the funeral, and the deceased must not be taken out of the house head first. But there are warning signs to look for to see if one may become a strigoi after death, and they are: if the deceased's eyes are open, if their mouth is open, and if their body doesn't get stiff and rigid. Romanians believe, however, that there are ways to keep strigoi away. They do this by rubbing the doors and windows with garlic, and garlic can be hung up throughout the house. In Romanian culture, it is a known remedy to keep evil spirits out of your house. Now you may be asking, can strigoi die or be killed? Well, they can be killed. According to Romanians, to kill a Strigoi, once and for all, you must cut off the head and place it at its feet, remove the heart and burn it, and finally, thrust a stake through the chest. A Croatian man by the name of Yuri Granso, who died in 1656, was the first documented vampire. Supposedly, he terrorized the villagers of his own town until his body was beheaded in 1672. In 1725, a Siberian man named Peter died and was believed to come back as a Strigoi. Peter came back to his house to haunt his son, and he demanded food. But the son refused to feed Peter, so he brutally murdered him. In 1909, Franz Hartmann states in his book, An Authentic Vampire Story, that children in the Carpathian Mountains began to die. The villagers suspected that a recently deceased man had come back from the dead. Afraid he may keep attacking, the villagers burned the man's castle to stop him from killing again. Another event took place in a small town in Romania. The year was 1969. After the death of an old man, several of his family members began to die mysteriously. The grave was dug up, and surprisingly the body of the old man showed no signs of decomposition. His eyes wide open and his face was red. The body was burned to save his soul. In 1970, a series of murders took place in Bucharest. What unfolded was the murder of 4 women, and 10 other women were brutally attacked. All of the attacks took place at midnight. In 1971, a man was arrested and identified by matching teeth marks on the corpses. The man would later get the nickname the Bucharest Vampire. It was said that during the trial the man seemed drowsy. Because of this, he was interrogated at night when he seemed to have more energy. The man was sentenced to death and became very angry. It took a few police officers to restrain him. After his death, his father died a mysterious death, and it was later found that the killer's father had matching fingerprints to a series of killings in 1944. The crimes looked very similar to the Bucharest vampire killings. In 2003, in the village of Maratino de Sus, a man named Petre Toma had died. Soon after his funeral, Petre's sister claims that her daughter-in-law became sick, and Petre was to blame. She claims that Petre had become a Strigoi and says that something must be done. So 6 local men went to the cemetery around midnight and stood around his grave. The men dug up his body, split open his rib cage, removed his heart, put stakes through his body, and sprinkled garlic over his body. They then burned the heart, put the ashes in water, and drank the water. The men would share the ashy water with the sick woman. More than a year later, the men still wouldn't be blamed by the villagers for what they did. One report comes out to say, well, the sick woman got better, so they must have done something right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It's amazing how well that's carried from all the way back to nowadays. Like they still do the same thing to try to remedy the vampire.
Right. And it's such like they were talking, the Dacians were scared of them back in 105, 106, 107, AD. The Dacians were still scared of these, what they call Strigoi.
That is wild. I like that name too.
Strigoi.
Strigoi.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to say when you're trying to riff off though.
Yeah. That's crazy though, especially the Bucharest.
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually tied to what they nicknamed, like I say, the Bucharest Vampire. The guy killed 4 people, 4 women, and brutally attacked 10 more. And they could identify him by the teeth marks that he left on the corpses because he was known to eat the corpses after he killed them too.
God, that's wild.
And then his father got arrested. Or no, he died.
Right.
And then they matched the fingerprints with other murders in 1944.
That's so crazy.
Similar to what he did.
That sounds like a movie all by itself. Like,
yeah.
Serial killer, vampire, mix up. Like,
yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it didn't have much to do with, like, Strigoi and everything, but I just thought I couldn't let that one go.
No, that's interesting.
That was crazy.
And it ties in.
Yeah, it got the nickname.
Yeah.
The crazy thing about me was I didn't know that Romania got its name from the Romans themselves. I didn't know that the Romans tried to take over it.
Right.
And then they couldn't handle it anymore. They could, I guess. but they were spending too much money against these Dacians. The Dacians were really hard people. They were like the Vikings of Transylvania, pretty much, is what they essentially were. So they were tough people.
Right. No, I never knew that either. I mean, it makes sense now when you really deconstruct it and look at it, but I'd never made that connection before.
Yeah, I never have either.
But you can definitely tell that through all those stories, I mean, still to this day in movies and even, in Dracula, like it's like all the classic vampire tropes are there between the garlic, warding them off, and the stake through the heart. And I don't think you normally see the removing of the heart and burning it, because I think usually like in movies you want to get the stake through the heart.
Yeah. It's a little graphic for movies too.
Yeah. But you're still dealing with like
ripping
murder.
Rib cages open and burning a heart. It's a little much, I think, for some movies.
I guess, but you're still killing something. You're putting a stake through the heart.
Yeah, but you're not brutally.
Not dismembering them, I guess.
Yeah.
I've seen crazier movies, but...
Oh, I know, but I'm just saying. For most people, they don't want to... When they see a vampire movie, they think stake through the heart, done. They don't think, like, let's rip this guy in half.
Let's cut his head off, put it at his feet.
Yep, sprinkle him with garlic, like the salt guy.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, these people in Romania are still scared of these evil spirits, Strigoi.
Clearly.
And I read up on a few other reports where villagers say that an old man or someone dies, and then they see that guy in his dreams, and all these people end up getting sick in the village. So these villagers go up and do something about his body, and then they stop.
That's wild.
Now, whether that's just in people's heads or it's actually something going on there is the question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think at this point it's so deeply steeped in that culture that you almost have you're predisposed to thinking, I guess.
That's what I mean, yeah.
That if someone dies, they could become one. So it would kind of make sense,
Kind of like the placebo effect almost on your brain.
Yeah. Or like it's like a chicken and the egg thing, Which one came first? Do people think about that first? Oh, this person just died and maybe they're going to come back as vampires.
I see
they
what
have
you're saying.
Nightmares, or are they having nightmares, which gives them the thought, oh my gosh, he must be a vampire, when they hadn't thought of it before.
Yeah.
Which I think in this case, it's so deeply ingrained in that culture that it's almost inevitable at this point, after, thousands of years of legend, that it kind of makes sense it would come to the surface like that. Even in modern times, I guess, for the, different parts of the world are still really deeply connected with their legends and folklore and still live by those rules and stories that were told back then.
Yeah, I mean, we had a teacher, and I won't say his name on here because, he was in the military. So, but do you remember him talking about the story when he visited Romania?
Right.
And he was in a cab, and the cab driver had the two front windows down, and our teacher he was sitting in the back seat, of course, put his window down, and the cab driver put one of the windows up. And our teacher curiously asked what he did that for, and the Romanian cab driver said that so that spirits don't come in the car.
Right.
Don't get into the car.
I think the thought is that they come in one and leave out the other. They don't get to stay. And if there's an uneven number, you could have two come in and only have one window for them to get out, basically.
But it's still, like, that was very recent.
Yeah.
That wasn't that long ago.
No.
That was within probably 10 years ago, I would say.
Probably.
So they still, to this day, are scared of spirits, Strigoi. They're very religious in that part of their life, The fear is still there.
Right. One of your accounts there is 2003.
Yeah.
That's for digging someone up and cutting them open and removing the heart and burning it and feeding the ashes to somebody. I wouldn't think of 2003 if it was, because I mean, it's not like they're not technologically advanced. It's not like they're some uncontacted tribe.
Yeah, these are people that, they have smartphones. They know what's good. They have everything that we have just about,
Yeah.
As far as people go. But it's not, like you say, it's not like there's some tribe in the Amazon that no one knows about. They're regular people. They have cities over there.
Yeah, I
And
think
this underlying fear still rips through towns.
yeah, it's weird the when you contrast the American view of a vampire to the Romanian, like we think of them as like in the movies. That's the only place that we
Yeah.
ever really any modern day person has any connection to is either reading about it in books, or seeing them in movies.
Watching Twilight.
Twilight.
Yeah. Even Bram Stoker's Dracula tells, of an undead beast that comes out at night out of a coffin and sucks the blood out of people and can turn them into vampires and stuff like that. But it's not totally true to what Romanian vampires are.
Right.
It seems like, of course, that's where people believe they stem from, obviously, because when you think of Dracula, what voice do you think of? You think of a Transylvanian voice.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's, of course, Bram Stoker. I'm pretty sure he's Welsh. He's not Irish. I'm pretty sure he's Welsh. He said, I was reading up something the other day of where he got the story of Dracula from, and it wasn't from Vlad the Impaler. He didn't get it from that. He got it from old folklore, from Welsh and Irish folklore about vampires.
Gotcha.
He didn't actually get it.
Did he get the name from there? Because was that
It means something totally different in Welsh.
Because I've always read that Bram Stoker was Irish.
I think he lived in Ireland, but I'm pretty sure he's from Welsh or Wales. Sorry, I'm pretty sure he is. I was reading this on Time. Time magazine did an article about it, so I read that to kind of uncover the truth about Bram Stoker's book. And he actually, like I said, he didn't get it from Vlad the Impaler or his name Vlad Tepes. As people think that's where they got it from.
Right.
But Dracula meant devil from where he was from. It meant something different.
Gotcha.
Like Dracula means dragon in Romanian because Vlad Tepes was part of the Order of the Dragon when he was kind of like a Christian soldier in a way.
And it was, I think the pronunciation was different too. I think it was Draculia or something like that. It wasn't straight up Dracula, was it?
No, it wasn't. No.
Or Dracul or something like that.
Yeah. But it meant like the Order of the Dragon. It didn't mean, devil like Bram Stoker's version does.
Right.
And actually, the book that is published isn't the original story that Bram Stoker wrote.
Do what?
Bram Stoker took his original writings and everything to the publishers, and they said, this is too dark. This is too rough. We can't do this. So that he had to go through and take things out of it that were too gruesome, too dark. And apparently, I think, don't quote me on it, you can look at it on Time magazine, look it up. They found the pieces of the original write-up somewhere in New England, I'm pretty sure. They found it. I think somewhere in New England.
That's interesting.
Somehow it made its way over there. But yeah, he couldn't, the book, Dracula, is not the original. He had to take stuff out of it because it was too dark, too menacing, they thought, for the public at the time.
I would love to read that manuscript.
Yeah.
That would be, because you hear stories like that a lot, like even Stephen King's Pet Sematary, when he wrote that and was kind of almost based it on his situation that he never had a kid die or anything like that, but he was...
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Sorry if anybody hasn't seen it. That's on them. They should see it by now. That's a great movie, and it's a great book.
See the original. Don't watch the new one.
Yes, I agree with that. The sequel's not very good either, the old sequel. But when he first wrote it, he shelved it because he thought it was way too dark, that nobody was going to want to read it at the time. And so it was sitting in a cabinet forever. And then eventually he came to the end of a book deal with his publisher at the time, and they needed one more book from him, and he was done with them, and he was kind of tired of them. So he thought, okay, I'll just throw him this one. And so he tossed that to them. And then it turned out to be this major bestseller, turned into a blockbuster movie.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably my favorite book by him. But when you don't, imagine if we would have never have gotten that, or if he would have reworked it in some way to try to polish it up to make it cleaner,
Right.
You wouldn't have that amazing story. And Dracula on its own, that we know of now, is a great story. But
It's not the original.
What would that be like?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I didn't know it. And like I say, the article is on Time. It's on their website, Time Magazine's website, if you want to go look it up. It's a good read. Vampires have always intrigued me. Same with werewolves, same with everything. Because it's almost romantic to think about it. How, like we were talking about this, like the Romanian civilization, they're not some backwoods civilization that, no one hardly has any contact with. They're normal, everyday people. They have skyscrapers and towns and villages and cities, but they're still scared of something that they believe is like an undead monster.
Yeah.
And that piques my interest.
Yeah, regardless of whether or not we think it's real, they totally do, apparently. And so I can't imagine living, because I mean, like to us, like you say, we've America's romanticized the idea of vampires to the point that they walk around with sparkly skin and are like these handsome teenagers who are going to school in Seattle.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy and so far removed from what actually started it, and we have a completely different view of them because we think of them as fun. And
like I say, we wear costumes.
Yeah.
Around Halloween to dress like them. But the Dacians thought they were evil spirits that would possess animals and would kill people. There's something a lot darker behind this fun legend, I should say.
Yeah.
But Romania in particular really intrigues me because that's the first place people think. So I wanted to dive into, all right, where did it start and what does it look like now compared to then? And it's apparently it's not crazy different. Like, there's still evil spirits. Some say they're dead and alive Strigoi. And like I say, the alive ones are sometimes known to be witches or something like that, or cast spells on people. And dead Strigoi are the ones that go out and kill people, apparently.
That's why I didn't know that either.
I didn't know. I had no idea. I didn't know there were dead and alive Strigoi.
Yeah, I just figured a vampire was a vampire,
Yeah. Yeah, like that one report, the boy's dad died, and his dad supposedly came back as a Strigoi and demanded the boy feed him. And when the boy didn't feed him, he killed his son. And same goes with the other report, is that, dead Strigoi, sometimes they're known to come back and act like nothing's wrong, walk into the house, nothing's wrong, and then slowly they start to kill off their family.
We'll have to get into zombies at some point, but that's almost like some zombie accounts, real life zombie accounts, where the people that are coming back just come back like there's nothing wrong. Like, they just think like it's, nothing happened.
Right. And the other thing that interests me is the reports of when people dig up the bodies to see if they are Strigoi. All the reports are the bodies haven't decomposed. Sometimes there's blood running out of their eyes or blood running out of their mouth or their nose. And they don't, another thing is they don't get rigid. They don't get rigor mortis, which is strange.
Yeah.
And they seem like they're skin tight. So they look like they're almost malnourished, but they have all this blood, and it looks like their fingernails are growing in a way sometimes.
Right.
But of course that can be, I believe, that it can be caused by just, dehydration of the body when the body dies.
That's everything I've read. Is it's actually because they say that the hair will actually appear to grow too.
Yeah.
And what science has explained it as is just the skin, like you say, dehydration and the skin retracting.
Yeah. And
pulling back, so it makes the nails appear longer, hair appear longer, and
right.
So it's.
But about the body's not decomposing. That's the weird thing.
Does that have anything to do with the climate of Romania? Maybe.
It may. It may be the time of year too. It doesn't talk about what time of year. Most of the time, it doesn't talk about the time of year that bodies were buried. But like the first report I went over, happened back in 1656, and this guy supposedly terrorized his villagers until his body was beheaded, 1672. So it took him that long to go up and finally get rid of this guy. He was roaming around for almost 20 years, just terrorizing people, and they supposedly went up after almost 20 years of being dead and took his head off.
God.
Yeah. That is how scared these people are. They go back and decimate graves because they're scared. And That's what interests me. Like, that kind of fear interests me, especially in today's world.
Yeah.
Because, of course, 1656, people thought witches were real, and people thought all kinds of crazy things.
Right.
But 2003 for them to go up and do all that, what they did.
They mean business.
That's a real fear. These are the vampires of Romania. Stick around for the New England vampire panic.
When we think of the word vampire, pictures of menacing figures in collared capes and medieval Roman castles probably come to mind. What we don't normally think of are Victorian-style American homes and whole populations of towns decimated by some unseen force. But that's where our story takes us tonight. The New England vampire panic began in the late 1700s and lasted through the late 1800s. During roughly an entire century of American history, communities from Maine to Connecticut were certain that dark forces were at work as their members began wasting away and dying off in succession. The people of New England were certain the dead were coming back to drain the life from the living and would continue doing so until they could be stopped. What we know nowadays is that the deadly hands of tuberculosis are what squeezed the life from friends and family far and wide. The victims would often start out with a persistent cough that slowly worsened, eventually reaching the point of coughing up blood. They would then begin to waste away and become emaciated, seemingly as though something was consuming them from the inside, hence the name they gave the disease at the time, consumption. Having no information about the highly contagious and deadly disease, the cause of consumption was unknown, but some thought vampires were to blame. Concerned townsfolk would go to some rather extreme lengths in attempts to quell the vampire's reign of terror, as we'll see when we break down some of the most bone-chilling accounts of supposed vampire victims in New England. Our first stop takes us to Manchester, Vermont in 1790. A man named Captain Isaac Burton is caring for his wife, who started showing signs of consumption within the first year the two were married. Unfortunately, she wouldn't even see their first anniversary, dying about a month before the 1-year mark. This devastated Isaac and both families involved in the tragic death of such a vibrant young woman. Isaac soon found comfort, though, in the arms of his deceased wife's sister, Huldah. The two began a relationship, and nearly a year after Rachel's death, they were married. That, however, would not last for long. Soon after being married, Huldah began showing symptoms of consumption as well. To the family and townsfolk involved, this could only be the work of Rachel coming back from the grave to suck the life out of her stepsister in a fit of jealousy and anger over the marriage of Huldah and Isaac. People's suspicions grew as the sickness seemed to take more and more of Huldah each day. Eventually, Isaac and his family became desperate for a cure, and desperate times, as they say, call for desperate measures. In February of 1793, almost the entire town of Manchester came out to witness what would surely be the most gruesome act many of them had seen. They looked on as the body of Rachel Burton was exhumed and disinterred. Once on the surface, her corpse was then cut open, and her liver, lungs, and her heart were removed. In ceremonious fashion, they burned Rachel's organs on a bed of coals, and the ashes were fed to Huldah. It was said this was the only way to break the vampire's grasp on their wasting victims, but it seemed it was too late for poor Huldah. She died in September of that same year. Because of the failed attempt to save Huldah, the townsfolk thought they might have misdiagnosed Rachel as a vampire, thinking instead that she must have been a witch. Regardless of what the gossip in town was, Isaac would go on to have 2 more wives in his lifetime, and from what I could find, neither of them had complications related to consumption. I'm sure this was curious to many at the time. Maybe they did break some kind of spell after all. Although this is one of the earliest records of vampires in America, it certainly wouldn't be the last. And while all of New England has its fair share of these dark tales, one state in particular seems to be the epicenter of the vampire panic. With over 80 confirmed vampire exhumations and more being discovered all the time, Rhode Island is unrivaled. The state also gets to boast the claim of having played host to what many call America's last vampire. Possibly the most famous case of all New England vampire stories is that of the Brown family. The Browns were a family of 5 who lived on a farm in Exeter, Rhode Island in the late 1800s. Although out in the country, they were not sheltered from the plight of consumption. In 1886, Mary Eliza Brown, the mother of the family, passed away from the disease, followed shortly by their oldest daughter, Mary Olive. Father George, son Edwin, and daughter Mercy would all try to pick up the pieces and keep moving on with life, even through the sadness and heartbreak. All was well on the farm for the next 5 years, until Edwin started showing signs of lung problems. He tried to ignore the cough, but it only got worse, and soon he was wiping blood from his mouth after each one. It was said with this symptom that George decided to send Edwin away to Colorado for treatment. It was thought that the dry air of the area would help resolve breathing issues and rid people of the sickness. After some time showing little sign of improvement, Edwin returned home only to find that his sister Mercy was in the throes of the same illness, only much worse. She declined quickly and died in January of 1892 at the young age of 19. After hearing about the succession of deaths in the family, the people of Exeter began to murmur about the possibility of yet another vampire taking siege over the area. George was not formally a believer of the vampire hypothesis, but he was at his wit's end. Plagued by death and despair, and desperate not to lose his only remaining child, he began to entertain the idea that maybe one of his departed family members had been overtaken by the demonic spirit of a vampire. On March 17, 1892, just 2 months after Mercy's death, the townsfolk gathered and began exhuming his deceased family members. One by one, they opened the caskets. They found his wife and his oldest daughter in an expected state of decomposition. But when they pulled Mercy's body out of her above-ground crypt, a wave of shock went through the crowd. Mercy, it seems, had hardly decomposed at all, and according to some accounts, her body was turned over as though she had moved after being interred. The town doctor began removing her organs, and as he did, seemingly fresh blood dripped out of them. This had to be their vampire. Upon seeing this, George became more hopeful that this was going to work, and he would have his healthy son back. Much like the case of Rachel Burton, Mercy's organs were placed on a nearby rock and burned. The ashes were mixed into a sort of tonic and fed to the ailing son Edwin. Unfortunately, this was not enough, and Edwin succumbed to the disease less than 2 months after his sister's exhumation. This is said to be the last chapter in the New England vampire panic, and Mercy is often called the last American vampire. Her story, however, lives on in a way that you might not expect. You see, the story of the Browns reached far and wide throughout the United States and even across the Atlantic. A newspaper article telling Mercy's story landed in the hands of a now world-famous Irish author named Bram Stoker, who in 1897 published a book we all know and love, Dracula. In this worldwide hit, there is one character in particular that sounds oddly familiar if we take a step back. Her name is Lucy, and she's a friend of the protagonist, Jonathan Harker. In the book, Lucy begins sleepwalking and acting strange as if she is being bewitched by the Count himself. Lucy, it seems, was most likely derived from poor Mercy Brown. The reason we think this is because of her full name, Mercy Lena Brown, which if you take an amalgamation of her first and middle names, Mercy and Lena, you can get Lucy. While these tragic events likely gave birth to some of the world's most famous, terrifying literary works, one can't help but feel sympathetic towards the people of the time, losing loved ones left and right, and having no real concrete answers as to how or why it was happening or how to stop it. They tried to give the disease a name and a purpose so it was easier to understand, but in doing so, they didn't stop the spread. They only furthered the mystery in their own minds and left us with legends and first-hand accounts of things beyond explanation. So that was a real brief overview of 2 stories, but the entire New England area was riddled with these accounts, and we're still finding new burials today, or vampire exhumations, and the evidence is kind of like what you were talking about in Romania. You had the legend of, the only way to kill a vampire is to cut off their head and put it at their feet. Recently in Connecticut, these 2 little boys were running around playing, and I say recently, in the 2000s. They came across these bones, and so they went running and told their parents, and they didn't believe them at first until one of them came back with like a femur or something. Oh. And they were like, oh my God, okay. So they went and checked it out. And what they thought at first, it was like, I think there were 29 bodies that they found. And it's not uncommon to find burial plots
Mass
like
graves.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they think it was actually from a family farm back in the day that was just unknown until then. But more than, I think it was, I have to double check it, but at least one of the graves, when they came across it, was it was weird because the legs were broken in a weird way, and a couple of the bones were crossed in an X over the chest, and the skull was placed right on top of it, almost like the Jolly Roger, like skull and crossbones.
Yeah.
And that was part of dismantling somebody so that they wouldn't, come back. And some of them were as innocuous if they thought somebody was a vampire. Like up in Maine, they say mostly what they did up there was they would dig up the body and just turn it so it was face down, and that was also supposed to stop it.
That's curious to me, how the decimation of the bodies is the same or very closely related to how it is in Romania. That makes me think, where did they get that from? Did they hear it from, is that just the thing other countries did other than just Romania?
Yes.
Or was it just a Romanian thing, and then they heard it from the Romanians, or someone from Romania said, this is how you fix the vampire problem?
So I think what we actually see, because these are also found in the UK and England before they reach New England. And so what the thought is that the legend of how to stop a vampire, and even what a vampire was in the first place, traveled west from Romania through Western Europe and made it to the Americas. So that's why we have even the similar, taking out the organs and burning them and feeding the ashes to the victims. That's where that comes from. That's a direct tie. So it's got to be that it comes from Romania, where the story started. So, news travels. And the interesting thing about like Mercy Brown, and why I asked about the climate in that story of the body from Romania. Yeah. So when you look back on it with a modern lens, Mercy Brown died. She died in January.
And it's cold up there.
And so it was common practice back then that's why she was above ground. After she died, they kept her body in an above ground crypt. And that's what they would do in New England, because in the wintertime it's too cold to dig down. Right. Everything's frozen. So they leave them there until the weather warms up, and then they would bury them, which could not have been fun. But that, I think, definitely explains the, why she had quote unquote fresh blood coming out. It was probably clotted.
Yeah. But
it would look way too fresh compared to somebody that was left out in the elements or even buried in a warmer climate.
Yeah.
She was just preserved was all. And they even mentioned that her fingernails had appeared to grow and her hair was longer. And so she had decomposed some.
Yeah, your body stops working, your heart stops pumping blood, the fluid comes out of you.
Yeah.
It does. It's a nasty way to think about it, but it is.
Yeah.
So without your fluid, you're shrunken a little bit. Your skin shrinks.
Right.
No, I didn't know anything about it. About all the big thing you hear about in New England is the Salem witch trials.
Right.
That's the biggest thing you hear about. You don't hear about vampires in Connecticut and Rhode Island especially.
Rhode Island. Yeah, the epicenter, over 80, and they think, certain experts think there could be hundreds of them. They're still discovering more all the time. But we have 80 confirmed vampire exhumations in Rhode Island alone.
I wonder why vampires.
Well, and that's the weird thing, too, that I wanted to hit on. Like, the idea of vampires in New England, and kind of how they started in Romania, too, doesn't start out as a physical form. They almost treated it as like a possession. Like a demon had possessed a spirit. Yeah. And was coming back. In certain accounts, there was another one, actually, I think in Exeter, the same town that Mercy Brown was from years prior, that people were having visions of that deceased person coming back and sitting on their chest at night. And that sounds a lot more in line with some of the Romanian stories.
Yeah.
I've never heard any mention of that in the Mercy Brown stories, but it's kind of morphed, because we think of a physical being that is a bad dude that can take control of people, kind of like hypnotize them and get them to do their bidding.
Right.
But it's more like I say, a possession kind of thing.
And that's the other thing about Romanians sometimes, or the vampires in Romania, like the one story about the kid's dad dying, and then the dad comes back as a Strigoi and kills the boy.
Right.
So that's a story that obviously he came back as not just a spirit, but as you and I sitting across from each other on a table.
Right. Almost more in line with a zombie.
Yeah, almost, yeah.
But this is clearly more spiritual. And I thought it was interesting in the Rachel Burton case how, and that's one of the earliest. There are earlier accounts in New England, but I thought that one was more interesting than the others just because of the thought that she was jealous beyond the grave of her stepsister marrying her still alive husband.
Yeah.
And so she was kind of draining the life force out of her to punish them. But in her case, they thought they misdiagnosed her after she died. They thought, oh, well, clearly the potion didn't work with the ashes, so must not be a vampire. She's got to be a witch. Like, that's an interesting, like, okay, it's not that, like...
It's not this freaky thing, it's this freaky thing.
Yeah.
It's not that she just happened to die from tuberculosis.
Right.
But that's the interesting thing about back then in the 1800s, is that in 1692, the Salem witch trials, is just the madness that people seem to get.
Right.
They almost get lost in this madness of, it is one or the other, you know. It can't be they just died. It's supernatural. It's a monster. It's something else.
And that's what I thought was really cool about, or not really cool, I guess, but interesting about the New England vampire panic is that it was a century long. It was literally like some of the earliest accounts were the late 1700s into the late 1800s, which that's a century of these kind of bubbles basically popping up all over New England. And there were even ones as far west as Ohio, and they just seemed to be more centralized up there for some reason. But the way that just gripped, and at the same time as the tuberculosis outbreak,
right?
You know, in some of these towns, the populations were decimated. Exeter specifically, I think, dropped from 2,500 residents to 900 some.
Jeez.
In a very short period of time. That's how crazy this disease was. It was the leading cause of death at one point. Ooh. So it was nothing, and people still get it today, but it's nowhere near as, you know, that we know now it's a bacterial infection, so you take some antibodies or antibiotics, and it's pretty treatable. It's still dangerous, but not a death sentence by any means like it was back then.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking 1800s here.
Right.
People still had muskets, man.
Yeah. And the time that, the very end, so around when Mercy Brown, when that story broke, not too long before that or after that, right around that same time was when somebody actually figured out, oh, this is a bacterial disease. And that's when your vampire stories in New England really stop. Huh. So it's very clear that, like, once the science was out there, they were like, oh, okay, we don't have to blame vampires anymore. We can kind of get a handle on this.
Isn't that just funny, though? How they blame some supernatural force. This mass hysteria goes over people.
Right.
And it just, like, they can't think it's just it's such a simple thing nowadays. You just think, oh, they must have had some kind of sickness. Our first thought is not, hey, she's a witch, she's a vampire. That's why she's doing that's why all this stuff's happening.
Well, and that's the weird part, too, is like they knew consumption was a thing.
Yeah.
But it was almost like they didn't understand the contagion of it, the contagious aspect.
Right.
Because, okay, one person got consumption and died, and then all of a sudden another person in their family got it. What the heck is that about? They never made the connection, I guess, that they were spreading disease.
The whole thing about the vampires, though, gets me. Because I can see them calling her a witch. Because that was more, prevalent, I feel like, in America. Where witches were more prevalent than vampires were. I wonder what started the thought process behind what, it's a vampire. I wonder where that came from, if that stems from someone coming over from England or Romania or somewhere like that.
I think you hit the nail on the head, because if you look at even some of the stories from Romania you were talking about
they're super similar.
Yeah, and it almost, like you talked about the people wasting away, which makes you think that kind of sounds like tuberculosis.
Yeah.
So they very well could have been dealing with the same thing, and because the people in America had people with the same problems, it was easy to make that connection.
Right.
What gets me is that, like, say there was when an outbreak would first start in a community, you'd have one person all of a sudden getting really ill for no apparent reason and dying. They don't necessarily make that connection right there. But as soon as somebody else they know, after the first person dies, if somebody else they know has the same symptoms and starts wasting away, they assume that because it was had the same symptoms, it must have been that other person that caused it. So they were almost right in a way, because that was the cause, but it wasn't a malicious spiritual attack. It was just bacteria.
Yeah, right.
So there is some kind of loose connection to, like, yeah, they almost had it right, but there was no malicious intent. It was just sickness spreading, which is kind of poignant for today, and how even coronavirus might have been perceived back then.
Yeah, I mean, anything. The flu. Look how the Spanish flu decimated people.
Yeah. And any sickness, but it seems like consumption specifically, and I think that has to do with the wasting away aspect of it.
Yeah. Because you're coughing up blood and you're slowly withering.
Right.
And there's nothing that can be done back then because it's bacteria.
Right.
So there's no remedy you can do to fix that. It's bacterial.
Right.
You need the antibiotics, antibodies for it. Oh, I did have to correct myself while you were going on. I did look up Bram Stoker. He is Irish.
I thought that was right.
I misread it in the Time article because the article talks about, I'm going to see if I can get this name right, Wallachian. And that's just basically Romania and surrounding areas around Romania, southeast of Hungary, I'm pretty sure. So it's just that big area. It's just that Wallachian. I thought it was Welsh when I first read it.
Right.
I'm dyslexic. So I read it, but it's Wallachian. And Dracula in Wallachian means devil. But Bram Stoker is Irish. He's not Welsh. So I do have to correct myself there. I want to correct myself.
I thought that was right, but I didn't. It seemed like you had done a deeper dive, so I was going to trust you on it, but I'm glad we cleared that up.
Oh, well, like I say, you can go look for it yourself on the Time thing. Yes. Just so you can correct me even more. But I wanted to correct myself because I had to look for sure.
Yeah, I might have done the same thing.
But I wonder, when did this happen, in the late 1700s and when the late 1800s?
Yep, all the way through. And it was this...
Because Bram Stoker came out with the book in 1897. Of course, it was totally different, though, from what people were getting.
Yeah.
Or encountering, I should say.
I'm pretty sure there's some... I think it's true. Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley and one other author were all on vacation together. They were all friends, and they all decided one night they were all sitting around telling scary stories, and so they each tried to come up with a scary story. And so those actually started the inklings of Frankenstein and Dracula, and there's one other book I'm blanking on. But so that it was kind of interesting how those major players kind of all came up with those ideas at similar times, but you can tell that Bram Stoker clearly drew inspiration from not only Romanian vampires, but they found, like I said, clippings from the New England Vampire Panic in his notes when he was doing research for Dracula, and that very same Mercy Brown especially pops up a lot. I thought that was amazing. That's such a cool fact that they're pretty sure that Lucy from the book is just a mixing of Mercy and Lena, which was her middle name, into Lucy. Because the characters is kind of similar in a lot of ways. I thought that was a really cool tie-in to Dracula and how it helped with, I guess, character development, really, in the story.
Yeah. Have you ever read the book?
A long time ago.
I've never read it.
I think I've got a copy of it.
Well, guess what? It's not the original copy.
No. God, I want that so bad. I want to start looking for that and see if it's out there somewhere. That would be amazing.
I mean, it is out there somewhere. Like I say, some guy in, I think, New England or something. Oh, New England.
Oh. That's when you said that, a light bulb went off my head, and I was like, I almost said something. I was like, just wait. We'll wait until I talk about my thing.
I might be totally wrong, but I think it's somewhere around there. Like it turned up somewhere in, I don't know where exactly. I can't remember.
Rhode Island.
No, I don't think so. It might be. I don't know. I don't remember. It's in an article. I obviously skimmed through the article. I didn't read that hard into it. These stories never cease to amaze me. Like vampires in New England.
Yeah.
And who'd have thought?
There's supposedly a movie out there too, and I'm blanking on the title, but it's kind of based on that. And even Lore, the famous podcast now.
Aaron Mahnke?
Yeah, Aaron Mahnke went over Mercy Brown specifically, I think in the very first episode of his podcast. And it ended up on an episode of the TV series that he did too. It's really good.
Yeah.
You should check it out sometime. He goes way more in depth than I do and is way more eloquent at putting it down. So I thought I'd kind of step back and look at the Vampire Panic as a whole, or a very, very like 10,000 foot view of what it was.
Did you ever find the first accounts in New England of vampires? Like the very first? Were you able to date it back?
There was one. It wasn't very long before Rachel Burton's story in the 1790s. It was, I want to say still in the late 1700s, but I say, it was a very like cursory account from what I could find. It wasn't very in depth at all.
Yeah.
And I was trying so hard. There have to be newspaper clippings still of Mercy Brown. And I even did some digging on Ancestry.com and went on to newspaperarticle.com, I think it's called, which is a database of newspapers dating way back. And I did searches for Mercy Brown in Rhode Island, and I couldn't find any. I don't know if it was maybe published in, a surrounding state or something, but I would really like to get my hands on those accounts first, the first-hand accounts.
You might be able to find something in like a museum in Rhode Island. I mean, how many museums can they have in Rhode Island?
That's a good point.
So small.
That's what gets me too. Out of like all the states, the majority of the vampire exhumations happen in Rhode Island.
That's weird.
That we know
Why
of.
Rhode Island?
I don't know.
I have so many questions. Like why that place? Why not, Vermont?
Well, there were plenty in Vermont too.
Oh.
There was more than one in Vermont. There was actually an account of a fairly well-known author, which again, kind of blanking on his name, but I read through his story as well, and he actually witnessed this family like digging up. He was basically like traveling and was staying with this random family that was like, hey, yeah, we'll take you in for a night. And he witnessed them digging up this person and desecrating them,
Yikes.
And he was like, he wrote it in a letter to his friend, like, you will not believe what these savages did. And was like,
these Vermont people, they're wonkers.
And like I said before, like Connecticut, there's plenty of them there. There's so much to pull from. And they're kind of all over the place. So I just tried to pick, obviously, the most well-known one.
Are they all the same when it comes down to the description of the vampire? Are they all just like spiritual beings instead of face-to-face, like, actual people, like some reports are in Romania?
Yeah, from what I could find, the closest thing to like a real in-person being was just like almost dreams is really how they described them, or visions of the deceased sitting on them and sucking their life force or stuff like that. It wasn't ever, I couldn't find anything of this person's actually getting up out of their grave and walking around and then going back.
Right.
So it's kind of a different interpretation of what we might think of as the classic vampire.
And again, that might be part of the mass hysteria. If stuff starts going around about vampires and stuff like that around the town, you might start getting that in your head. And then when you start getting something in your head, you start dreaming it.
Right.
Of course, If you think about it long enough and hard enough, you start dreaming about it.
Right.
So maybe people start dreaming that they see a vampire, and maybe it's fueling this mass hysteria.
Yeah, and someone actually, I forget who wrote this, but they were comparing the vampire panic to the Salem witch trials, and what they talked about was how in the Salem witch trials the victims were people who were alive, and they killed them because of this.
Yeah.
And in the New England vampire panic, the victims were already dead.
I mean, that's like Romanian too. They're strigoi. They're dead.
Right.
They're dead people. They're not people that are living and get turned into a vampire in the same way that we know today.
Right.
You get bit in the neck and they don't totally suck your blood out, I guess you become a vampire.
Yeah. And when I say victims, I mean the people who they thought were vampires, I guess. And I would say wrongly accused of being vampires, at least in the New England setting. I don't want to disparage any Romanian beliefs, but at least in this case, I think it's very clear that it was tuberculosis. And luckily, nobody went out of their way to harm a living person in this. You did have the victims suffering from tuberculosis, which is awful, but that was never brought on. Nobody ever saw a person sick with tuberculosis and was like, he's turning into a vampire, and killed him.
Yeah.
So that is one, I guess, kind of brighter spot. You still have grave desecration, which is...
That's never good.
Not cool, but it's a lot better than hanging people for, false charges.
For being human.
Right. Yeah. Although these tragic events happened long in the past, the legend still lives on, and it probably always will. This is the New England Vampire Panic. This concludes tonight's episode of the Black Flame Podcast. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Black Flame Podcast.
Be sure to come back next week for a new episode. And remember, stay spooky.